Dr. Lachuk asks, what attitude did other minorities in Galicia or Halachina take towards the Soviet regime in 1939 to 41? Specifically, did Polish and Jewish populations collaborate with Soviet occupational forces, or did they support Ukrainian groups opposed to the Soviets?
This, of course, is a touchy issue, specifically, as far as the Jews were concerned, many Jews were communists. This is explained by the fact that a large part of the Jewish population was urban population. A large part of the Jews were proletarian workers to whom communism appealed both in Galicia and in Soviet Union. Therefore, sociologically, they were more amenable to the ideas of Marx than, let us say, was the Ukrainian peasantry. As communists, of course, they welcomed the arrival of the Soviets to Western Galicia. That was the initial response. This immediately set up a very tense relationship between Ukrainians who were opposed to the Soviets and certain numbers of Jews who were communists and welcomed them. We don't have statistics. We don't know what percentage of the population, when we say most of the Jews were not communists. There were many Jews who were anti-communist. Jews suffered from the communist regime in the sense that the communists imposed the nationalization on trade, which hurt the Jewish merchants. So, of course, many suffered. But the Communist Party in Western Ukraine, which in 1940 numbered roughly 16,000 members, had a disproportionately large number of Jews, and of course these cooperated with the communists. For some of them, during this period, their fate was rather sad in that among the first people to be executed by the Soviets were the members of the Communist Party of Poland, who were perceived as being Trotskyite and therefore slated for execution. But it is a fact that initially there were a certain number of, let's say, Jews who welcomed the arrival of the Soviets, members of the Communist Party. It's difficult to generalize for the population as a whole. As far as Poles were concerned, the Poles were first confused at the arrival of the Soviets. Many of them thought that they were coming to help them against the Germans. Generally, the Polish position was that they preferred to cooperate with the Soviets than the Germans. After all, the Germans were the primary enemy. It's always the case of who is the primary enemy. For the Poles, the Germans were the primary enemy. It was clear that they would have to fight the Germans. So collaboration, if you might call it, or at least they preferred to deal with the Soviets than the Germans. Of course, there were huge disillusionments and disappointments for the Poles. Also, we know the famous case of Katyn, where 10,000 Polish officers who surrendered to the Soviets were executed by the Soviets soon afterward. But this was kept secret and did not come out until 1941. So I hope this is a response to your question.
Are there any other questions? There's a question at the back. It's like bingo or show games on television. There's a question asking Professor Subtelny if he did not make a slip of the tongue when he spoke of the election of 1922. Did he mean the election of 1939?
No, the election, October 22, 1939. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You have referred to a surprise attack by Germany in 1941. I was a witness of a massive concentration of Soviet troops in the last 4 months before the start of the war in Western Ukraine. I'm sorry I cannot read the rest of this. Would you like to just speak to it? Easier. Very briefly, if you could just read it.
Also, there was
Please read your question.
Also, Soviet government made announcements which were published in the press explaining this concentration of the troops as for the repurpose of maneuvers. How then we then talk about a surprise attack?
This is sort of a common canard. It was a surprise attack. It was a surprise because Stalin did not want to believe that Hitler was going to attack. We all know that it's common knowledge that he had warnings. The British, the Americans sent him warnings. There were deserters from the German army that came over to the Soviet side, warning the Soviets of an impending attack. Information was coming in. It was simply that Stalin did not want to believe it. It's one of these paradoxes that the one deal that Stalin believed in, the one political leader that Stalin trusted was Hitler. And he was convinced that the deal that was made with Hitler would stick and that Hitler would not double-cross him. Therefore, hence the surprise, the feeling that it couldn't happen despite evidence to the contrary.
The other question here is that some social scientists believe if it had not been for Hitler, the Russians may have dominated or subjected more European nations to their communist system. Please comment.
This is in the realm of speculation. I don't know what would have happened, but I would be very hesitant about seeing Hitler as a defender of anybody's liberties.
And a question by Roma Jęczyńska. I have heard that because of the Nazi-German pact, the Soviets instituted a news blackout concerning the worst developments in Nazi Germany, and in fact, between 1939 and 1941, conducted favorable propaganda on Germany's behalf. This means that many under the Soviet regime were unaware of the true character of the Nazis. Is this in fact true?
Yes, obviously, the question of information is paramount. People did not know everything about the Nazis. People did not know the ultimate plans. It was one of the tragedies of the Ukrainian nationalist movement, for example, that very few of the leading Ukrainian nationalists ever read Mein Kampf. There is very little indication that this book was well read in Western Ukraine. And the very few who did read it never took it seriously. It's not only the Ukrainians who did this, Germans in Germany did this. As far as the nature of the regime, well, if 80% of the Ukrainian population were peasants living in villages, what can a peasant in a village know about a regime? What can he perceive? He perceives the few low-ranking administrators he deals with. The news media is controlled. What can he know about the system, either in Galicia or, for that matter, in Soviet Ukraine? Yes, as far as the question about control, yes, that is true that the Soviets, during the pact, stopped writing about internal developments in Nazi Germany. Up to 1939, there was a constant anti-fascist stream of information. When the pact was signed, the news media stopped writing, the Soviet news media stopped writing about internal developments and obfuscated the nature of the Nazi regime during the early years of the war. Although generally I would say that most of the population of Soviet Union expected a war with Germany. In fact, they were surprised when the pact was signed. There was an expectation, given the years of anti-fascist propaganda and polemics that existed before.
Question from Mr. Ilnitsky. Was it not the anti-Semitic policy of the Nazis that caused the Jews to welcome the Soviets as a lesser evil?
Well, there were 2 points. If a Jew was a communist, he welcomed the communists because they bought in the type of system that he wanted to see. If a Jew was a non-communist, he of course feared the Nazis as soon as he realized what was happening, because they threatened his life. So it depended. You can't generalize about Jews. There were various Jews who had various perceptions of what was happening, and one has to be specific. Probably the large majority, of course, feared the Nazis as soon as they realized what Nazi plans were.
I think we should all be rewarded with coming out so early in the morning, at least of all me, and most of all me. It is now 5 after 10. Let's adjourn exactly at 20 minutes after 10. Thank you very much.